The Earth Foreigners and the Minoan Religion, by guest author March 25, 2023. Guest article by Berk Gümüs.
The Minoan civilization was a highly developed pre-Greek civilization that inhabited many islands in the Aegean and Mediterranean Seas and even a part of modern Turkey. Their center, however, was the island of Crete. They had a writing system, a central administration, and a strong position in the sea trade of the Mediterranean. This culture flourished for many centuries on the island during the Bronze Age 3000 BC, 1100 BC. But they really hit their peak starting at around 1750 BC during the so-called Neopalatial Period. Just to give an idea on how far back that is, the Minoans built their elaborate palace of Knossos more than 1,000 years before the ancient Greeks built the Parthenon.
(213th contact Tuesday, the 2nd of December, 1986, 3:17 HRS).
Two factors were to blame for the fall of the Minoan culture, namely, on the one hand, the disorder of the Minoan society, which was very divided in some respects, and which created evil hatred in the various social structures, even due to the disagreement that the Minoan Empire threatened to fall apart. The cultural structures split apart, and soon the whole thing threatened to degenerate into a war of the entire citizenry, and thus of all levels of society. But before this could happen, a tremendous natural disaster occurred, namely as the Santorini volcano erupted.
Excerpt from Figu Bulletin 61 translation.
As the human wants, however, on the island of Crete, situated off the mainland, a people with a highly developed culture were settled, the Minoans, also called the Atlanteans. One day, far in the north, in the open ocean north of Crete, the volcanic island Santorini, modern Thera, exploded and sank into the ocean. Consequently, a giant tsunami devastated the island of Crete, from which the Minoans fled to the Greek mainland. There they encountered the wild, uncultured, and primitive Hellenist descendants, who were instructed by the Minoans in all arts and trades, as well as in written and spoken language. Thus the Greeks got to know culture. However, since that time, the text, the alphabet, and the language were Minoan. This remains so up to the current day, with an insignificant change. Since the original Minoans were in a stark minority in relation to the Hellenists, they interbred, and after a few hundred years no Minoans of pure race existed anymore. In their level of consciousness, the Hellenists themselves had never been on even footing with the Minoans, and so, over further centuries, they remained on the same level of consciousness to which the Minoans had brought them. They lived in accord with that and made no progress.
There are two writing systems that the Minoan civilization on Crete used, Linear A and Linear B. Linear B has been pretty much decoded. Linear B is an early form of Greek. Linear A bears a lot of similarities with Linear B, but it remains officially undeciphered. It was primarily used in religious texts. Therefore, one could perhaps assume that when it comes to the Minoan religion, everything remains speculative. Right? Not entirely. Because there are plenty of records of their religion, namely in the form of images, from which in turn we can recognize their religion, and what or who exactly the Minoans worshipped and why. Besides Linear A and B, there is also the Cypro-Minoan language that was used in Cyprus and various hieroglyphic writings before Linear A, one of those mysterious hieroglyphics we can observe on the surface of the Phaistos disk. See? The Phaistos disk, an ancient document written in an alien language.
Minoan clay tablets from Crete, showing Minoan writing.
The Minoans undoubtedly worshipped a female goddess. This is not just a theory out of the blue, but a theory based on the fact that whenever you see a seated figure in Minoan representations, it is female and represents some kind of queen. Not once in Minoan art are there seated men.
Solar goddess and queen of heavens receives libations leonine demon servants in her celestial palace. Ring from Tiran's 14th century BCE.
Why is she a goddess? Because she is usually depicted together with eagles that flank her. Sometimes she has wonderful griffins next to her.
Goddess seated flanked by eagles facing her sun. Sun appears above her, identifying goddess as solar divinity. Ring from Mycenae showing a goddess and fathered griffin.
She seems to be in some kind of otherworldly landscape. Things seem supernatural and inspire the imagination. She looks like the Virgin Mary, so to speak, except that she has naked breasts. But this is necessary to show that she is the source of life, of all life. So she is divine and not a normal person.
Fresco Minoan goddess from Crete.
Also, she often has another god next to her, who looks very strong and athletic but is smaller than her. Not in the sense that he is subordinate to her and not strong, but simply younger than her. So it could represent a mother-son relationship and not an erotic one. They never touch, kiss, or hold hands. It's always very hierarchical.
Goddess and god engaged in conversation, possibly with god receiving instructions. Ring from Mycenae. Goddess and her son with signs appearing above firmament. Seal now in Geneva.
One could therefore think that the Minoans were a matriarchal society that practiced a kind of female worship, but feminization of religion does not represent a matriarchy at all. Let's take, for example, Christianity, where the Virgin Mary is more important than Jesus Emmanuel in some countries like Italy, Spain, or South America. But it does not represent a matriarchal culture.
Virgin Mary. (831st contact, Tuesday, the 3rd of January, 2023, 9:08 HRS).
So I will say more about what I was talking about before. As my father wrote, the foreigners of that time, whose distant descendants can still be observed in earthly airspace, were of a female nature but also male earth humans in great numbers, who allowed themselves to be worshipped and glorified, but also built many buildings, etc., and taught Earth's humanity various forms of writing.
This also applies to the research being carried on in Greece, especially concerning the Minoans, the Taurus, etc., who, supported and guided by the foreigners of that time, created very remarkable buildings and made jewelry, about which the archaeologists of today are still puzzling over who actually made them and where they came from, and so on. The fact that the ancestors of today's foreigners were the actual creators is something that especially those who carry a title and think they are clever and think that they have eaten the knowledge with shovel diggers and are even wise are unable to grasp due to their lack of understanding.
So, if the great female goddess, also called the solar goddess, that the Minoans worshipped actually belonged to the earth foreigners, then the so-called solar phenomenon, respectively the Marian apparition of Fatima that took place in Portugal in 1917, also would make sense, which was projected by the descendants of the earth foreigners.
710th contact, Tuesday, the 11th of September, 2018, 21:14 HRS.
Then I want to end this subject and hear from you what you have to say about the matter of the Giza intelligences, who were in reality the earth foreigners, of whom there has been talk since time immemorial. So I have another question about Fatima, because at that time, on the 12th or 13th of October 1917, tens of thousands of onlookers in central Portugal were able to observe and witness a furious solar phenomenon. As early as the mid-1950s, Ascot told me that the whole thing had been arranged by the Earth foreigners, whereby Ascot also took me back in time to the exact moment when the event took place, which gave me the opportunity to observe the spectacle for myself and to realize that the alleged solar phenomenon had been conjured up for the whole crowd of onlookers by an Earth foreigner's flying objects.
But now one should also fairly ask oneself the question whether also the descendants of the Earth foreigners were not behind the Lord's appearances, because further in the 710 CR the following is reported.
Nevertheless, Ascot, your daughter Semyase and I, at the 34th contact conversation, on the 14th of September 1975, foisted a misinformation on the public, because we said something that was only half-truthful, namely the following. Sam Jace, you have experienced and recognized that the appearance of lords was a projection as well as the fantasy figure of Satan, which you projected into your field of vision as a child by your own powers. And you also know very well that as another example, the appearance of Fatima was nothing else but the evil play of the Giza intelligences, who let one of their ships appear in radiant light, and then one of their female life forms appeared as the Mother of God, although they made the mistake that the woman remained in her spacesuit, and this was registered by critical observers. You know these events very well, and it is completely illogical to ask again. So it was said that the Fatima incident was something arranged by the Giza intelligences, but this did not correspond to effective correctness, for it was fundamentally only an evasive truth, the meaning of which was explained to me but concealed from the public. The explanation was that the whole truth could only be told when at a certain time in the new millennium all or part of the whole connections could be revealed and would no longer cause any problems. The disclosure could be today, if we can talk about it now, as you recently said and explained that it could be in the month of September. So I think that now, with regard to the presence of the Earth foreigners on Earth, it should be explained that through them, really abductions and so on, and also other occurrences have taken place. If you yourself would say some clarifying words about this, there would then also be clarity in this respect.
I can do that, but there is not much to explain, because for various reasons connected with the Earth foreigners and the black men, as well as with the U.S. and other secret services, we had to behave in such a way that we pretended to be uninformed, and our contacts appeared unreal from the point of view of the Earth foreigners, the black men, and all the various secret services. This could only be done by distancing ourselves from calling the Earth foreigners the originators of the Fatima phenomenon, for if we had done so, the insidious efforts of the dark men and secret services against you would have continued.
Marian apparitions and pilgrimage in Lourdes.
Lourdes is one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in the world and is located in southwest France near the Spanish border. The pilgrimage to Lourdes began with a series of a total of 18 Marian apparitions from February 11th to July 16th, 1858. From February 11th, 1858, it is said that the Mother of God repeatedly appeared to 14-year-old Bernadette Soubirous at the grotto of Massabielle, near the river Gave de Pau. Bernadette was collecting wood when a beautiful lady appeared to the girl in the grotto. The apparition is said to have been dressed in white and belted in blue. The grotto of Massabielle was at that time a place where, among other things, garbage was burned and pigs were herded. During one of these visions, Bernadette uncovered a spring in the grotto, the waters of which were said to have healing properties. Every year, 4 to 6 million visitors make a pilgrimage to Lourdes, and thousands firmly believing in a possible cure take baths in the spring water. Studies have not found any unusual mineral composition in the spring water, but it is of drinking water quality. The ecclesiastical and secular superiors initially regarded these apparitions, which ended on July 16, 1858, with suspicion and tried to prevent the crowds. Only after some time did priests and bishops also believe the girl. When the village priest Dominique Peyramal asked Bernadette to ask the apparition for her name, Bernadette delivered in reply, "I am the Immaculate Conception," a theological term that had only recently been dogmatized by the Pope. Peyramal said that Bernadette, as the uneducated daughter of an impoverished miller, could hardly have known this term. On this he was convinced of the authenticity of the apparition.
Grotto of Massabielle with the figure of the Virgin Mary.
Another example is Egypt. When the male pharaoh Akhenaten, who is often called a heretic king because he introduced monotheism, did not feminize the god, because the god was abstract. God was only the sun disk, that's all, there was no gender. But he was the representative of that god, and he feminized himself, and made himself look almost androgynous, to show that a god is made up of both genders together.
The ancient Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. It is likely that in this duality, mother and son, we have something similar in Minoan Crete. The mother goddess and her powerful athletic warrior son. Goddess seated on her divine palace, facing her son. Sun appears between them, identifying goddess as solar divinity. Ring from Thebes.
This goddess would also have had a representation in Minoan society, namely the queen and the queen mother, because in Hittite and in Egyptian culture, the highest offices, the highest positions, were reserved for the queen and the queen mother, who acted as high priestesses of the chief female goddess.
Snake goddess, or a high priestess performing a ritual, from the palace of Knossos.
From the images, it is also possible to reconstruct some of the rituals of the Minoan culture. The king and the queen probably led the processions.
Fresco of a Minoan ritual.
It could be that they left the palace of Knossos to go to the sacred mountain called Juktas. This can be easily seen from the palace, because on the top of this mountain there was a shrine, so it is easy to imagine a procession that many people followed, led by the king and queen.
Mount Jukta Shrine.
Other rituals included offerings, public worship, and the distribution of bread and meat to the people. Sometimes it was animal sacrifices, which was very common, or simply things like bread, cakes, or raisins, etc., as was common in various other cultures. However, there were also human sacrifices.
Minoan animal sacrifice. Egyptian animal sacrifice. (750th contact Saturday, the 22nd of August 2020, 017, HRS).
Like Joseph Carey Merrick, the so-called Elephant Man, the second son of King Minos and his wife Pasiphae was also severely physically deformed and had a certain resemblance to a bull's head, as well as a completely disfigured figure and face. And as was the case then, and as is also the case today, the boy was disowned by his parents as a result of his already congenital physical deformity. At that time, disabled children were usually killed at birth, but Minotaur, as he was called, was not. This was because the king and his wife feared that the sea god had brought about the whole of the body deformation as a punishment, because they had spread evil insults against him. Therefore, they were afraid that Poseidon would take new and even worse revenge on them if the son who had been deformed by his might were killed. So Minos and Pasiphae decided that a court servant, Aphaia or so her name was, should take care of the son and bring him up, far away in the vast countryside. Minotaur had a good intelligentum, was of a very peaceful nature, and had been astonishingly well educated by the court servant, so that one could converse with him through a translator. When he was grown up and also made aware of his origins by his governess, he tried to get to the court and demand his rights, but this led to the king and his wife reacting viciously, and consequently commissioning Daedalus to build a labyrinth, which was actually a huge cave, to imprison the physically deformed son in. However, always fearing the vengeance of Poseidon, they tried to appease the sea god by arranging for human sacrifices to be regularly offered in the labyrinth, but only youths of both sexes, who were first chosen from the population, stolen and killed as sacrifices, but later by Athens after war had been waged there, and the Minoans had been victorious. What must ultimately be mentioned with regard to the whole matter is that, as a result of the sacrifice of young human beings to appease or calm the god Poseidon, and out of fear of revenge, the lie arose that the imprisoned man called Minotaur, who had been cast out by his father and mother because of his deformed face, head, and body, was a human eater, which is why the human beings sacrificed to Poseidon would also serve him as food.
One is able to interpret the Cretan belief system by looking at what was happening outside Crete at that time. Because it didn't happen only in one place, there were similar belief structures, not only in Egypt, but also in the Levant, in Anatolia, and around in the Hittite Empire. What scholars usually do is to project the Greek religion into the past, assuming that there is a complete continuity over 3,000 years, and that the religion of the Minoans somehow survived until the time of Pericles. It is too long a time with too many changes. Whereas it would make more sense to look at the contemporary world, with which Crete, of course, had trade contacts, and thus had many common beliefs, including the worship of the sun, as well as common symbols such as the so-called horns of consecration right picture, which are exactly the same as the twin mountains of the Egyptians. Left picture. I do not think that the horns of the Minoan consecration represent horns, but mountains, because in between them the Minoans saw the daily sunrise, which was so important to them because it symbolized the beginning of a new cycle, respectively a new life.
Egyptian ideogram for mountain.
Which is in contrast to the Greek mythology. They had sun deities like Helios or Apollo, who were also sometimes associated with the sun, but they had no main sun deity. There was no worship of the sun, as there was among the Minoans. There are so many differences between the Greek religion and the Minoan religion, which should make one resist the continuity theory, because where is the mother goddess in the Greek pantheon? They had Zeus, who also had a mother called Rhea, but she was hardly worshipped. She was a secondary citizen, from which we can see the abolition of the mother goddess. And where is the solar religion? The Greeks did have sun gods as mentioned, but they received no worship. No Greek worshipped the sun, and these are two big differences. And thirdly, the symbols of the Minoan religion have disappeared. One has neither the twin mountain nor the double axe. They do not exist in the Greek cult.
Minoan double axe.
According to the theory of archaeologist Nanomarinatos, Nanomarinatos is Professor Emeritus of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, whose research focuses on Minoan civilization, especially Minoan religion. The double axe represents an allomorph or another form of the sun. It is said to represent a duality with two equal sides, just as the sun has this duality. Day and night, light and darkness, etc. According to Marinatos, the double axe represents a regenerative symbol, which is also often shown among plants, because plants naturally grow just like the double axe. Or it is shown on the bottom of the sea. What is the double axe doing on the bottom of the sea together with fishes? It supposedly symbolizes how the double axe animates the fish, respectively breathes life into them.
Pythos from Knossos.
Through this series and other complex syllogisms and images detailed by Nano Marinatos in her book Minoan Kingship and the Solar Goddess, a Near Eastern Koine, she came to the conclusion that the double axe represents the sun, which in turn casts Minoan Crete close to Egypt. For Egypt is the birthplace of the solar religion.
Egyptian images that represent solar religion. Symbols of sunrise as a becoming or coming forth by day. Minoan double axe. Egyptian scarab. Excerpt from the book Minoan Kingship and the Solar Goddess, a Near Eastern Koine by Nano Marinatos.
A peculiarity of the double axe is that it sometimes blends with the Egyptian ankh, a sign of life. The ankh has many variants, such as the knot of Isis. The Minoan hieroglyphic script includes the ankh as its own sign. Evans noted that the similarity of the Minoan and Egyptian hieroglyphs, as well as the relationship of the double axe with what he called a scared knot, and came to the conclusion that it signified life and divinity. Indeed, the solution is very simple if we adapt a Near Eastern coin. In Egypt, Syria, the Levant, and Anatolia, the sign of the ankh means life. In the Hittite Luwian script, the meaning of ankh as life is quite clear. Helmut Theodor Bossert, a Hittitologist and contemporary of Evans, systematically explored the similarity of Hittite signs to their Minoan equivalents, and arranged them into a table, shown here as figure 9.15. In the Egyptianizing seals of the Middle Bronze Age, the ankh also signified life, health, and blessing, and we sometimes see the ruler in front of the ankh. Fig. 9.16. Why does the double axe merge with the ankh sign? It is because they both signify regeneration and life.
Even though the Minoan solar goddess is constantly seen holding or wielding the double axes, she was not the end point as a goddess. She may have been the embodiment of the sun, but the sun was above her in a universal sense as a non-gendered and non-binary entity.
Gold ring from Mycenae goddess depicted with double axe. Goddess with rosetta in one hand. Goddess with double axe.
On the one hand, there was an anthropomorphic deity, and on the other hand, beyond that, abstractions such as spirals and things that obviously had a religious meaning, which represented the abstraction of the goddess.
Minoan vessel.
So, who were the Earth foreigners whose distant descents are still frequently observed in earthly airspace today? If the Minoan solar goddess and her son, the standing god, who were depicted on countless Minoan ornaments that can be seen above, represent the far descendants of today's Earth foreigners. Then this raises new questions again because the visual formula of seated goddess and the standing male god was not unique to Crete. As mentioned earlier, one is able to interpret the Minoan belief system by looking at what was happening outside Crete at that time. There were similar belief structures, not only in Egypt, but also in the Levant, in Anatolia, and around in the Hittite Empire. Could therefore also maybe other descendants of the today's Earth foreigners, on different seals and hieroglyphs etc. from Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and around the Hittite Empire be depicted and seen?
Seated goddess and storm god Hadad Baal. Old Syrian seal. Wikipedia.
Hadad, or Iskar Sumerian, was the storm and rain god in the Canaanite and ancient Mesopotamian religions. He was attested in Ebla as Hadda in c. 2500 BCE. From the Levant, Hadad was introduced to Mesopotamia by the Amorites, where he became known as the Akkadian Assyrian Babylonian god Adad. Hadad was also called Pidar, Rapiu, Baal-Zephon, or often simply Baal Lord, but this title was also used for other gods. The bull was the symbolic animal of Hadad. He appeared bearded, often holding a club and thunderbolt while wearing a bull-horned headdress. Hadad was equated with the Greek god Zeus, the Roman god Jupiter, and in the cult center near Dolicha in Asia Minor he was addressed as Jupiter Dolichinas, as well as the Hittite storm god Teshub. The Baal cycle, also known as the Epic of Baal, is a collection of stories about the god Baal from the Canaanite area, who is also referred to as Hadad, the storm god. This collection of stories is dated between 1400 and 1200 BC and was found in Ugarit, an ancient city located in modern-day Syria.
Stele of Baal with thunderbolt, 15th–13th century BCE. Found at the Acropolis in Ras Shamra in the ancient city of Ugarit. Baal bronze statue from Ugarit 14th–12th century BC.
In the 750 CR, we can read that King Minos of Minoa, supposedly the son of Zeus and Europa, actually existed and was not a fantasy figure from Greek mythology, as well as the other gods and demigods of Greek mythology mentioned in the 069 and 317 CR.
69th Contact Friday, the 10th of December, 1976, 041 HRS.
Aha. Were the gods and demigods of Greek mythology such settlers from space?
Sure, they were a splinter group of descendants of the Hyperboreans.
Oh well. Now I understand to some extent the connections. Good old Heracles said some very wondrous things, which just refer to it. But now I wonder how big these Hyperborean descendants must have been, because with Asket, I once had the opportunity to see something that will probably remain closed to the Earth human forever. And exactly according to what I saw, these Greek mythology gods or demigods must have been several meters tall. Heracles alone must have measured about 3 meters, right?
317th Contact. Monday, the 17th of December, 2001 at 2347 HRS.
Then another question. Were there early connections between Aristotle, Apollo, Zeus, and Congregation and the ancient Lyrians and Vegans?
No.
39th Contact. Wednesday, the 3rd of December, 1975. 137 HRS.
But Mount Shasta is not the only place where this race lives, for already at very early times they divided themselves into 3 smaller peoples, with the other 2 living unrecognized and deep underground on the Aleutian Islands and in Alaska. The whole population amounts to just about 700 human beings.
That is fantastically interesting, and now a few things dawn on me. But you have just said something about their appearance. from which I could infer that with this race living underground, it concerns very distant descendants of the real Hyperboreans.
You infer correctly.
532nd contact, Saturday, the 24th of December, 2011, 16 o'clock, HRS.
And is this the case with all three groups of the unknown Earth foreigners to you?
Yes. With these three groups is, however, to understand here that it concerns a matter about them of three different factions, who, however, all together build a unity, thus belonging together, and in accordance with our observations of only one origin, however, who have different areas of responsibility on the earth. Of three groups is only generally to speak, because our realizations of these earth foreigners is that they are clearly organized for certain tasks in three different terrestrial areas, in which they become evident and are variously working. So one group moves entirely in the west continental area of Antarctica over Tierra del Fuego and all Americas with various islands up to Alaska and to the Arctic. Then another group moves in entirely Europe with Africa and all islands, with Greenland, Eurasia, Arabia, Madagascar, and the Arctic, as well as various islands. And finally, the third group moves entirely in Asia and Oceania with all islands, as also in Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, and in a part of Antarctica.
Thus, also, here once again a misunderstanding, for we always thought that with the three groups may have meant three different Earth alien races, which would come from different worlds.
In the 505 CR, it is said that these Hyperborean descendants who lived underground on the Aleutian Islands, in Alaska and Mount Shasta, would have left the Earth and returned to their peoples. But perhaps there could be more behind it, which for certain reasons is concealed in the contact reports.
505th contact, Thursday, the 18th of November, 2010, 2210 HRS.
Quetzal once told me outside of an official conversation that you took all the inhabitants from Mount Shasta and on the Aleutian Islands and in Alaska.
That is correct. We have tried to get all the inhabitants of the three places to return to their peoples, with whom they have always been in contact. We gave them the reasons for our own withdrawal from the earth, which led to their withdrawal. Their dwellings and all the trappings have returned them to their original earthly state, so that there is no longer anything to indicate their former presence. The process in this regard was the same as in the Pyramid of Giza and on Mars.
I understand. So then you did not take them away yourselves, but they left of their own accord with those who came from their original homeland, but simply on your advice. I've misunderstood something. But can you tell me where these human beings actually belonged, respectively to which people?
That is not a secret. They were distant descendants of a lineage of the old Lyrians, to which they also returned.
Then they are, so to speak, related to you, the Plejarans, because the Plejarans' peoples came out of the old Lyrians.
Enthroned goddess Ishtar? Faces ruler. Old Syrian seal found in Cyprus. Wikipedia.
Inanna is an ancient Mesopotamian goddess of love, beauty, war, and fertility. She is also associated with beauty, sex, divine law, and political power. She was originally worshipped in Sumer under the name Inanna, and later by the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians under the name Ishtar. She was known as the Queen of Heaven, and was the patron goddess of the Eanna Temple at the city of Uruk, which was her early main cult center. She was associated with the planet Venus, and her most prominent symbols included the lion and the eight-pointed star. Her husband was the god Dumuzid, later known as Tammuz, and her Sukal, or personal attendant, was the goddess Ninshubur, who later became conflated with the male deities Ilabrat and Papsukal. She was especially beloved by the Assyrians, who elevated her to become the highest deity in their pantheon, ranking above their own national god Ashur. Inanna Ishtar is alluded to in the Hebrew Bible, and she greatly influenced the Ugaritic Ashtart and later Phoenician Astarte, who in turn possibly influenced the development of the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Her cult continued to flourish until its gradual decline between the 1st and 6th centuries CE in the wake of Christianity. Inanna appears in more myths than any other Sumerian deity. She also had a uniquely high number of epithets and alternate names, comparable only to Nergal. Many of her myths involve her taking over the domains of other deities. She was believed to have been given the Mes, which represented all positive and negative aspects of civilization, by Enki, the god of wisdom. She was also believed to have taken over the Iana temple from An, the god of the sky. Alongside her twin brother Utu, later known as Shamash, Inanna was the enforcer of divine justice. She destroyed Mount Ebi for having challenged her authority, unleashed her fury upon the gardener Shukalatuda after he raped her in her sleep, and tracked down the bandit woman Bilulu and killed her in divine retribution for having murdered Dumuzid. In the standard Akkadian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ishtar asks Gilgamesh to become her consort. When he disdainfully refuses, she unleashes the Bull of Heaven, resulting in the death of Enkidu and Gilgamesh's subsequent grapple with his own mortality. Inanna's most famous myth is the story of her descent into and return from the ancient Mesopotamian underworld, ruled by her older sister Ereshkigal. After she reaches Ereshkigal's throne room, the 7 judges of the underworld deem her guilty and strike her dead. 3 days later, Ninshubur pleads with all the gods to bring Inanna back. All of them refuse her except Enki, who sends 2 sexless beings to rescue Inanna. They escort Inanna out of the underworld, but the Gala, the guardians of the underworld, drag her husband Dumuzid down to the underworld as her replacement. Dumuzid is eventually permitted to return to heaven for half the year, while his sister Geshtinanna remains in the underworld for the other half, resulting in the cycle of the seasons.
Goddess Ishtar on an Akkadian Empire seal, 2350-2150 BCE. She is equipped with weapons on her back, has a horned helmet, and is trampling a lion held on a leash. Hepat followed by her son. Hittite relief from Yazilikaya, 13th century BCE. Wikipedia.
Hebat or Hepat was a Hurrian goddess. She was the tutelary deity of Halab, modern Aleppo, in origin, and in that role appears already in pre-Hurrian texts from Ebla. Her status was not identical in all Hurrian centers. While she was the main goddess in the pantheons of Halab and various cities of Kizzuwatna, her role in Ugarit and in eastern cities like Nuzi was smaller. Due to the influence of Hurrian religion, she was also worshipped by Hittites and Luwians, as well as by some of their Neo-Hittite successors. Hebat's best attested role is that of the wife of the weather god, whose identity varied depending on culture and time period. In Eblate sources, she was associated with Adad, while in Hurrian ones with Teshub. Late sources from Tabal associate her with Luwian Tarhunt.
Possible depiction of the Hittite sun goddess Arinna, also called Hebat, with her son. Seated goddess Isis nursing Horus, a sculpture from the 7th century BCE. Wikipedia.
Isis was a major goddess in ancient Egyptian religion whose worship spread throughout the Greco-Roman world. Isis was first mentioned in the Old Kingdom c. 2686 c. 2181 BCE as one of the main characters of the Osiris myth, in which she resurrects her slain brother and husband, the divine king Osiris, and produces and protects his heir, Horus. She was believed to help the dead enter the afterlife as she had helped Osiris, and she was considered the divine mother of the pharaoh, who was likened to Horus. Her maternal aid was invoked in healing spells to benefit ordinary people. Originally, she played a limited role in royal rituals and temple rites, although she was more prominent in funerary practices and magical texts. She was usually portrayed in art as a human woman wearing a throne-like hieroglyph on her head. During the New Kingdom c. 1550 c. 1070 BCE, as she took on traits that originally belonged to Hathor, the preeminent goddess of earlier times, Isis was portrayed wearing Hathor's headdress, a sun disk between the horns of a cow. In the Hellenistic period 323–30 BCE, when Egypt was ruled and settled by Greeks, Isis was worshipped by Greeks and Egyptians, along with a new god, Serapis. Their worship diffused into the wider Mediterranean world. Isis's Greek devotees ascribed to her traits taken from Greek deities, such as the invention of marriage and the protection of ships at sea, and she retained strong links with Egypt and other Egyptian deities who were popular in the Hellenistic world, such as Osiris and Harpocrates. As Hellenistic culture was absorbed by Rome in the 1st century BCE, the cult of Isis became a part of Roman religion. Her devotees were a small proportion of the Roman Empire's population, but were found all across its territory. Her following developed distinctive festivals such as the Novigia Mysidis, as well as initiation ceremonies resembling those of other Greco-Roman mystery cults. Some of her devotees said she encompassed all feminine divine powers in the world. The worship of Isis was ended by the rise of Christianity in the 4th through 6th centuries CE. Her worship may have influenced Christian beliefs and practices such as the veneration of Mary, but the evidence for this influence is ambiguous and often controversial. Isis continues to appear in Western culture, particularly in esotericism and modern paganism, often as a personification of nature or the feminine aspect of divinity.
715th Contact Saturday, the 23rd of February 2019, 2151 HRS.
Good. Then my question regarding the Phantom Airship Wave 1896 to 1897, after which I asked you to clarify what it was about.
There is not much to say about this, but only a little, namely that these were demonstrative maneuvers of Earth foreigners who have been working on Earth since time immemorial, and whose present descendants are also still here today, and can be observed again and again all over the world.
Description of the flying objects and crews.
As far as the descriptions were not limited to moving lights, the phantom airships were predominantly described as elongated dark objects, sometimes with wings that could also fly against the wind and were equipped with glaring headlights. Even if occasionally the object was described as having shot away like a bullet or as having abruptly changed altitude or course, the flying objects were usually reported to be moving slowly and could therefore be easily observed. Among the many hundreds of reports, only one describes the airship as a 12-meter-long hat-shaped object, which is very close to today's idea of a UFO. A typical description of the airship is found in the Chicago Chronicle from the 13th of April, 1897.
The machine was plainly seen and was about 60 feet, 18 meters in length. The vibrations of the wings were also distinct. It was studded with colored lights as usual, and the engine and a kind of music as of an orchestra were heard.
And a witness named James Hooton of Arkansas, described as a well-known railway conductor, provided the following description of a landed flying object and its takeoff on the 20th of April, 1897. A closer examination showed that the keel was divided into two sections. In front, it flared out like the scabbard of a knife. The flanks were flared towards the middle to converge again at the back. On each side were three large wheels made of a flexible material that pressed in when they rolled. I noticed that in front of each wheel was a 2-inch tube from which air was now being blown onto the wheels. The wheels began to turn and the ship rose with a hissing sound. Suddenly the plane made a leap, pointed its bow skywards, and the rudders at the end were swung to one side. The wheels were now spinning so fast that the spokes were barely visible. Faster than I can tell, the ship was gone. Reports also appeared of several landings involving contact with crew members of the Phantom airships. These were almost invariably described as ordinary human beings. Sometimes it was a woman, sometimes a medium-sized man with tinted glasses, a man with a long dark beard, or a small man with a light blue sailor suit. When spoken to, they always answered in English. The few surviving accounts of giants, alien or non-human flight occupants are, in CNAP's opinion, false statements.